Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, Bill Tamblyn. Hello there. We're going to talk about a great old-timer tonight who figured in a lot of things on Grays Harbor and who left a lot of friends when he was through with his work. He was about as colorful a figure as most of them came and is figured in a lot of local history a generation back. Our character tonight is Chief Bill Tamblyn of the Aberdeen Fire Department, whose burly figure was a familiar sight on Grays Harbor streets 25 years ago, and whose activities make good telling because he was one of the longtime leaders in civic affairs and one of the town's most picturesque people. So when Dick has had a few words from our sponsor, we'll turn the pages of the scrapbook to the story of Bill Tamblyn, the Welsh engineer who skippered Aberdeen's fire ladders for more than a quarter of a century. Now, Dick, a few words from our sponsor. It was about 1904 that Grays Harbor first saw Bill Tamblyn and adjusted its bifocals and took a good look at the newcomer because he was something to see. He was big, burly, strong as an ox, and his face had a Welsh-British contour that made him look like a flesh and blood image of John Bull himself. He talked with a salty twang, and whenever he did with gusto to let you know that here was a man who loved life and everything that made it, and he was going to wire the last drop of goodness out of the thing called living. Bill had some family connections up around Oakville, but he blew into town from Vancouver, British Columbia via Tacoma. He had been in the business of fighting fires. His trade, if you could call it that, was that of a stationary engineer. And in Vancouver, he had plied it in keeping the big pumpers of the fire department in working order. So, since the city of Aberdeen was looking for an engineer for its new city pumping station, Bill Tamblyn's application was given serious thought. In fact, he got the job, and for several years, Bill kept the pumps running to push the city's water supply above ground. But his association with the firefighters in Vancouver kindled in the big Welshman a love of red wagons, the smell of smoke, and the excitement of a wild dash for a blaze and the fight to get the fire out. And when he'd seen Aberdeen's new department racing for a fire, it reminded himself to put in an application for a job there. And one day he did. And Adam Snyder, father of the pioneer Snyder family, including Joe Snyder, the Aberdeen football star of the early teens, and the late Jasper Snyder and Mrs. Helen Ovid, and Adam Snyder gave him a job. In fact, they made him captain in the city's fire department and put him in charge of the pumpers as an assistant chief. It was 1908, and it was the beginning of one of the most colorful careers ever logged in the local public affairs. In 1911, he was appointed chief, and in 1912, he found a running mate who was to be paired with him in his civic activities for the rest of his days. The man was Charlie Borum, who joined the fire department that year. When he took over as chief, Big Bill was ready to make it the most work at the job in the city's government. Behind his favorite horse, Big Prince, Chief Bill made practice runs with new equipment over Aberdeen's plank streets and new paving. In his white helmet and shrouded slicker that made him look even bigger than he was, he winged to dominate a fire as though he dared it to put up a fight. Roaring through his megaphone with a bull voice, he took command when his department went into action and handled his role with skill that was once professional and dramatic. He was the town's idea of a fire chief, And more important, he was the kids' ideal. One pat on the head from Chief Bill was worth more than gold to the town's youngsters. For Bill Tamblyn had a big heart and his barrel chest, and a sense of humor that made him the life of any party. He also had a great love of animals. Charlie Borum, who, though the big Welshman, quarter of a century's service, was probably his closest companion and best friend, recalls the affair of the well-fed tomcat as an example of Bill Tamblyn's affection for dumb creatures. One day a big cat showed up around the fire station. So large was it, and such proportions, that Chief Bill decided it was about to enjoy a distinction of motherhood. Disturbed at the thought of the cat being homeless at such a time of dire need, Bill fixed a bed for it in the city hall's furnace room, patted it well with old blankets, and made the cat a home in a warm, dry corner. He watched over the animal with an almost fatherly interest, taking it food and instructing the firemen as to how the cat was to be treated. Sometimes his last chore before he turned in for the night was to go down to the furnace room and feel around in the dark corner to see if the kittens had arrived. The cat became very friendly. In fact, appeared to be well pleased with its lot in life, and it became Chief Bill's hobby. That is, until one day when Charlie Borum suggested that the cat might not be an expectant mother. And when Bill had trotted the pampered animal out into the sunlight and made a more personal acquaintance with it, he discovered it was just a well-fed tomcat. It was hard to live with Chief for a few days. Bill Tamblyn had a great sense of humor, however, and he finally developed quite a story of his mistake. One that left the listeners laughing with tears in their eyes when he told it to them on the street corners. It was his informal stories that gained for him the reputation of being quite a talker, and one day he talked himself into a position that he had worried himself about. He met the Reverend Charles McDermott, pioneer pastor of the Congregational Church. It was a casual meeting, but the chief was wound up. Before the two parted, Bill had delivered quite an orientation on whatever was on his mind at that moment. It was impressed on the Reverend. A few days later, he called on Bill and invited him to take the pulpit someday. But that was a big man, and he balked. Spinning yarns on the street corner was one thing, but talking from the pulpit in a church was another. But the Reverend McDermott was adamant. He was determined to put Bill into the pulpit for a public address, and he finally wormed a promise out of the chief that he would take the pulpit. The date was January 14th, 1917. It is an important date because it was when the church hung out on a standing room only sign. The whole town turned out to hear Bill Tamblyn's sermon. As the day for the talk approached, Bill began to take an interest in what had been at first an awesome chore. He organized an instrumental trio among his firefighters from 3 of the boys who played guitars and mandolins. He enlisted the aid of 2 of the harbor's musical matrons. It was Fireman's Day in the old church of the Pilgrims. Well, Bill started slowly. His close friends said it was because the pulpit restricted his language. He had to develop a new vernacular for his talk. But he finally warmed to the subject, and before he was through, he was hammering the desk and gesturing with the oratorical flourish. Moreover, he held his audience spellbound, and when he had finished, the church rocked with applause in the most unorthodox fashion. The big audience got its money's worth, and Bill had established himself as a public speaker to reckon with. Oh yes, the subject that he had selected was fire prevention, and no one could say that Chief Bill didn't know his subject and take it seriously. And from that day on, the chief was a frequent speaker in public places. Bill's big heart got him extracurricular work. He couldn't hear of a sick friend, a family in need, or an acquaintance in trouble without wanting to help them. And most often he did. The chief was a robust man with a he-man's appetite, and he never liked to eat alone. Charlie Borum recalls that many a late dinners he would call up to the chief's office for a club sandwich before retiring, and Thanksgiving and Christmas, when the popular head of the fire department was showered with invitations to dinner, he would often accept 2 or 3 of the invitations and eat with equal relish at each of his host's house. After a night run, he would send to one of the local restaurants for a basket of food. Big Bill made one slight pass at politics. It was when he ran against Albert G. Hopkins, the town's crusading constable, for the office of mayor. Hopkins had won out in the preliminaries, and Bill decided to oppose him as a sticker candidate in the finals. Hopkins was one of the few men in town whose wave of popularity topped the chief's, and he won out. Although Big Bill pulled one of the biggest totals that a sticker candidate had ever received. But it made the chief mad. And when the Civil War Veterans Dinner of the election met Bill on the street one day, the chief shook his fist in the winner's face and said, "You'd better get a new chief, because I won't work for you." It was the only job in town. The new mayor added anxiously, "You'd better quit before I ask you," and then concluded the conversation. That year, Assistant Chief Borum was appointed chief and appointed Big Bill his assistant. And there started one of the strangest stems in the city has known. For when politicians came and went, and the administration turned over the city offices, one or the other of the 2 veteran firefighters was always named chief. And whoever received the appointment always named the other as assistant. Between the 2 of them, the Aberdeen Fire Department functioned continuously and without hitch. In July of 1934, with his time in for retirement, Chief Bill took off his blue suit with the brass buttons and turned the red Buick Roadster over to Chief Charlie for the last time. He was financially independent. He had built and owned the Tamblyn building, occupied today by the State Street Employment Office. It stands on Wishkah Street, 1 block west of the bridge. And now the chief settled back to take it easy. For a few weeks he tried to ease himself out of town, but his life had been built of activity and the low pace had no interest for him. The following spring he decided to learn a new business, a fish hatchery operation. He went over to Soap Lake to study the care and cultivation of fish. But right here, I want to interrupt for Dick Crombie to say a few words from our sponsor. It was the spring of 1935 that Chief Bill took up fish culture as a hobby. And it was along in the fall of that year, while working with the supervisor at Soap Lake, that he snagged his left thumb and contracted fish poisoning. Blood poisoning, it was diagnosed. On the 16th of October, Bill returned to Aberdeen, not feeling so good, and checked in the local hospital. His friends didn't even know that he was in town, but word went out from the hospital that Big Bill was back and feeling low, and that several friends dropped in the days to follow. They found him looking fit, but a little hazy about details, and the attendant termed his condition serious. No one doubted that the big frame man had become so familiar on Grays Harbor over the more than 30 years would throw off the ailment. But Big Bill would not be back on his feet in a few days. But it was not to be. He had walked into the hospital at 10 o'clock in the morning of October 16th. Before 7 o'clock that evening, he was dead. And the whole town mourned the passing of Big Bill Tamblyn. In his time, he had become the local tradition. One of the smoke fighters mentioned not long ago that we seldom make clam chowder in the kitchen at the fire station without someone mentioning Big Bill. He always was pleased and happy to sample any savory food. Added a little spinach or a little pinch of salt. Tasted it again. Always relished each bowl as the best he had ever tasted. He was a character in search of an author. Was Big Bill Tamblyn, and such one of the famous heroes in our hometown scrapbook. Thank you for listening.